Hello, welcome to Decision Moments. My name is Ozonnia Ojielo, your host. Decision Moments is the platform where we interrogate the challenges that leaders have faced in advancing national development, particularly the most intractable ones. So today we begin a series of interviews that are linked to the 60th anniversary celebration of Rwanda's membership of the United Nations system. And in the context of this celebration, we want to go back a little bit in time, 28 years ago, during the terrible moments, the immediate aftermath of the genocide against the Tutsi. And we'd like to interrogate a number of critical incidents or critical events that happened and how the incoming government addressed them. So today my guest is Madam Christine Umutoni. She was Director of Cabinet for Reintegration and Rehabilitation in those difficult moments of 1994. And since then, she went on to become Rwanda's ambassador to Belgium with concurrent accreditation to the European Union and subsequently Rwanda's ambassador to Uganda. She has since joined the United Nations system, as now she's my counterpart, and she served as resident coordinator in Eritrea and currently as United Nations resident coordinator in Mauritius. But we will be discussing the immediate aftermath of the genocide against the Tutsi and how the government addressed the big issues. Madam Christine Umutoni, welcome to Decision Moments.
Thank you.
So let's begin by exploring the challenges, the humanitarian issues that arose during those difficult days and how they were confronted. So tell us, when the movement entered into Kigali, what did you find?
In 1994, obviously, we found a country that was completely devastated in all senses, in terms of economy, the social fabric, the governance, the human factors, people displaced, others refugees, others returning. The country was really unstable. And so it had all the phases like conflict, humanitarian, and destabilized the nation and a destabilized people at that time. So I think what I would focus on is that Rwanda at that time, though in deep crisis in terms of the war and crisis, because the war seemed to have ended, but there were insurgencies coming in, and there was therefore military, political conflict was still ongoing, even if the country was being built. Humanitarian in that there was nothing completely in terms of well-being of the people, and we had to mobilize a lot of humanitarian support. But at the same time, the fabric of the nation had been broken. So there was need for reconciliation, for national unity, for people to form a nation as human beings. But governance institutions had also been broken, so a need to recreate, even from the constitution itself, and the parliament, the government, all those had to be, and yet at the same time looking at the economy, looking at building the manpower. There was no capacity. So today we talk about triple nexus. At those days we didn't have a word for it, but we just knew that we cannot wait to finish conflict, then do humanitarian, do development. Everything was happening at the same time, but you would know that this phase is mainly crisis, this mainly humanitarian, until the country graduated to development.
So you've talked about so many multiple things happening at the same time: displacement, ongoing conflict, insurgencies. What was the key criteria to then focus on humanitarian issues? What were the motivations?
I think, first of all, the country went to the deep, like if you can say, crash to the bottom. Like you cannot go anywhere below. And then there was a motivation to survive, to be. For those who survived, there was that drive that the country must exist. So for example, my role as Director du Cabinet in the Ministry of Rehabilitation and Social Integration, we were in charge of refugee repatriation, organizing the displaced people taking back home, but all the humanitarian work, feeding the orphans, the widows, and looking at all those, and yet at the same time thinking along the reconstruction. So I think the good thing is that as the RPF came in and they joined forces with other political parties, there was a political program and some sort of a medium-term plan, or a vision, I should say, but broken into small pieces. I think this is where the country decided that to be able to tackle all these problems, we need the human capital. So many Rwandese diaspora returned to build their country, not knowing where they are going, but just coming to see what they can do. So I think the strategy was to discuss even with the partners. Yes, we have a deep humanitarian crisis, but we are not going to be building tents or building things that are not sustainable.
That's very interesting, because here you are telling us about that the country went to the depths of failure, as it were, total collapse of the system. And my next question to you would have been, what were the first steps or the initial decisions they were taken, and what were the outcomes of those? But then you just said something crucial, that the country, the leadership decided from the get-go that you didn't want tents, you didn't want people staying in camps. Why was that so?
I would say it is the vision of the leadership. And it was a good vision that we all followed. I think it emanates again from already what was the practice in the RPF, I guess, because it had been a long, protracted war even before the genocide. The genocide happened, there was the continued sort of stop the genocide, and the people already involved knew a bit about resilience and a bit about building from small but looking for large. I should say that actually the genocide sort of brought a big shock in the entire system, because originally it was a liberation war to liberate the country from a bad regime and bad practices, and then the genocide hit, shook really the system, but even if the country was shaken, but leadership remained strong and focused. So I remember, for example, when we were setting up ministries, we had our guidelines, even with the humanitarian actors. You don't come in here with briefcase NGOs, you must show credentials that you can support humanitarian action. And when you do support humanitarian action, you're not going to perpetuate people from feeding from food stamps forever. Yes, food stamps for a moment, but at the same time distributing seeds. That's why it was important to not sustain for long the displaced people's camps, because for how long can you stay displaced in your own country? So hence the move to bring back people to their villages so that they can start a life, however humble. And while bringing back people to their villages, and hence the focus also on return of refugees. Some people in government had been refugees for many years, and they knew a little bit about how being a refugee is bad. In fact, part of the political program was to end the refugee problem forever. So a massive return of refugees, about 2 million. I think UNHCR was really overwhelmed because they were dealing with refugees and returnees, returnees because they didn't know where to place them. They had to find a place to settle them and stuff like that. So it was a combination of many things, but the vision was to stay as short as possible into this deep humanitarian and build the fabric of society. And since the country had gone through a genocide, it was very necessary to heal, even from physical wounds, mental, from, psychological. People were shaken. So you will see when you read everything that was happening was merging. You cannot, we needed the reconciliation program.
So can you describe some of the specific actions they were taking to address the physical, the emotional, and the psychological wounds?
Yeah, so for example, of course, for the physical, I mean, part of why there was a specific ministry for rehabilitation and social integration was even to deal with people as they had been cut with their machetes, they had lost legs, or they had lost, parts of their body. They were still, like pulling people from swamps and putting together, hospitals. That's why today when you see hospitals, they started as makeshift hospitals. But that's why I told you that every support that was given was, say, when you give us support for hospitals or for medical, don't give us a tent or a makeshift or anything, because give us a structure which we can build on to continue. So there was that. But for the emotional sort of rehabilitation, I should say much of it, because the whole nation was traumatized, and you cannot have a counselor for everybody. So the Unity and Reconciliation program, there was a whole commission of Unity and Reconciliation that was meant to make people talk. People used to say Rwandese meet all the time, Up to today, we have the national dialogue. This talking was important to make people communicate, relate. But also the Gacaca courts, helped in a way, because much as we wanted reconciliation, but also we wanted justice. And we wanted a special justice in this circumstance that also brings in reconciliation, because otherwise a million people died. If you have to go through the conventional courts, it will take 100 years and justice will never be seen to be done. Although the Arusha Tribunal had started, it was slow, but Rwanda looked into its traditional indigenous homegrown solution. And I think from that time, it was important for Rwanda to look into itself for solutions, while working also with international partners to see what they can do. So hence the meetings, the meetings to search how can we deal with that.
We'll come back to some of those experiences, particularly on the quasi-judicial mechanisms that were implemented. I'm interested in the approach that the movement took, the leadership took, because historically up to that moment, we had classical understandings of how humanitarian operations work. And here, you were saying to international actors, don't build temporary shelters for us. If you want builds, give us structures we can build upon and scale up and expand. We don't want camps. We want people to return to their villages, so target your support. How difficult was it to sell that kind of message, that kind of approach? Because that was new at that time, and I wasn't sure it had been done elsewhere up to that moment.
In fact, it was not easy, because there is typical or stereotype kind of dealing with humanitarian. First, you find people who are almost on their knees, like consuming everything that is given without choice. But I think we talked about the resilience that had been built among the leadership, that also tried to, however much people had suffered, but to try and, survive, exist, here we are. the country is still here. We have to build it. There had to be a country in Rwanda. It's almost like it became in every Rwandese DNA that we must survive. But I think what the leadership did was to stick to principles, you know, to stick to the principles and say our way of dealing with the humanitarian situation is not to perpetuate the humanitarian situation, but is to use humanitarian support with a focus to help the humanitarian situation, but also look to the future for sustainable development. I remember actually after a short while, Rwandese didn't want to hear a thing humanitarian. Everybody was saying, no, we have to move to develop. It was a conflict because the humanitarian, I think, also mobilized resources because they portray a humanitarian situation. And here is a country that doesn't want to portray itself like that for a sustained period. Yes, for a short period, but even the orphans, for example, there was dealing with the orphanages, but the drive was to have every child has a family. I have an orphan I took because we went and we said the best way for children to live is not in orphanages. But this is contrary to humanitarian situation where you must group kids here and then bring things and give them difficult from when you take them. So there was some sort of a pull and push, but I think at some point, because the explanation and the design and the desire of the government was so strong, I think in the end there was, we understood very early that anyway, when we mobilize these resources, it is for us. It is not for anyone else. And we determine. So if we want to build, I remember we were telling UNHCR to build schools and not to build tents. So when people come back to their villages, when refugees return, they need to find schools. And those schools we determined, because it's the resources you give us. If we use it, if you give me $50, it's up to me. I can use that $50 to buy a tent, and I'll tell you I bought that tent at $50. But I can also be frugal because, you know, fight against corruption started way long time. You know, working with little to produce a lot started way long time. So I can decide to use that 50 to build a proper infrastructure, which actually today most of those schools that were built for returnees ended up now being secondary schools, and some of them are now universities, because the original structures were strong and it was deliberate. So use all the resources, whatever you are given, but with the focus. It's like you build a house and you know you want 4 stories, but today you can only afford, you know, level 1. So when you build level 1, you build it with stands that whenever you come to level 2, level 1 will not collapse. So that was the thinking actually for everything that is happening, even for governance institutions. I remember when KIST was being built, it was also a huge discussion for how long are we going to rely on external expatriates, you know, technical assistance, you know, placing people in ministries to do, yes, temporarily for a period of time, but as we build our own, you know, capacities. How do we build our own capacities? We need institutions. We will bring people from Rwandese, from Tanzania, from Canada, from where. We will even get resources from, you know, aid organization or UN or partners to build. But it was difficult to convince people that you can build an institute of science and technology during the humanitarian. Because normally during the humanitarian crisis, you're supposed to be building, you know, simple makeshift things that are not this. But we knew our needs, you know. So our need right now, yes, we see that we are going to get some technical assistance, but this will not build the nation. We need to be building the Rwandese who are growing up now. We need to, even when we place people in the ministries, to have people work with them and have a plan for when they will graduate. But so we need to start, you know, empowering the universities and doing. We also did some programs of bringing the Rwandese experts from abroad. Some of the ministers that you see today came from the diaspora, and you know, to build the nation. So it was quite a lot of things brought together, but the vision was not to build from it was to build from a strong foundation and then build for them.
I would like to come back to this vision thing much later, because as many countries in Africa grapple with their own development challenges, it seems that a lot revolves around this vision question. But you know, going back again to the ecosystem in which you did, the country did all these amazing things. How was the relationship with the United Nations system in those difficult days, given that the UN itself, the Security Council, had authorized the withdrawal of the peacekeeping mission at a moment of critical need and challenge for the country? And then you come back, destroyed country, destroyed infrastructure, everybody was a victim, traumatized country, and the UN is present. How did you manage the relationship with the UN to be able to achieve all of this? What were the difficulties that we encountered?
Well, I can give partial answers to such a question, because the relationship with the UN was being managed at a higher level than me. But what I saw as a person in the system was that the relationship was difficult. It was difficult because people had been disappointed at the reaction of the UN, the withdrawing of the peacekeepers at a very, at the wrong moment, if I should say, the misreading of whatever had taken place. So I believe Rwandese believe that it could have been handled better, and that the international community had disappointed them, and the UN is the face of the international community, so to say. When you say international community, the UN carries the flag of the international community. So it was a tough relationship. But I think also the leadership of the country was very pragmatic to know that we can engage and discuss, you know. The UN itself was quick to notice that that was not correct. I think it was Kofi Annan at that time who visited the country and tried to make the relationship correct. But we also, the country knew enough about dealing with the UN with its different facets. There is the UN political, the secretariat and the different organs. There is the UN humanitarian, there is the UN development, and all these, you can't deal with them in a different way. So I believe what the country did was to be pragmatic, to understand anyway we are member states, and certain resources we're entitled to. And it's up to us to really engage with the UN how we are going to use these resources while we deal with the politics or with the diplomacy or with the things on how we relate with the UN. And because I was particularly in the Department of Humanitarian, I should say, and although I said there was no nothing like strict humanitarian development, but I was mainly in that department where I'm dealing with displaced people, with refugees, so I was more with that other UN, which is providing humanitarian, and which is also, because development agencies also were here in the country. So I think in the end, the conversation was around engaging the UN to understand what could have been the past mistakes, how they could have been corrected, but also knowing that the country is a member of the UN and has to play its role, but also to benefit from what the UN offers as development or partnership, to engage, to create a strategic partnership and grow the country. So, yeah.
Fascinating. So then it would be interesting, you know, when you talk about how devastated the country was, and looking back now, what do you think were the most important considerations that the leadership had in mind in determining what to focus on? Because there were just too many things that needed to be addressed. Resources were limited. What were the main issues that informed the prioritization and where resources then were deployed?
I believe in the first instance, the country had to be stabilized. So I know that the security organs were busy trying to secure and stabilize the country. At the same time, the people in the country had to learn to live together, and there had to be mechanisms to make that happen. Hence, the unity and reconciliation, the Gacaca, the different institutions, even the entire process of coming up with a new constitution was, you know, a conversation that went on. But then at some point also, it was necessary to begin to, and I remember the first attempt on the economy was the PRSP, the Poverty Reduction Strategy, which in the end I think developed into Vision 2020 and so on. So at the same time, looking at stabilizing the country, looking at the poverty, people really were poor, infrastructures had been destroyed and everything, and then going beyond poverty reduction to creating a Vision 2020. I think what Rwanda is good at is to make everybody own those things. You know, like even my mom knew Vision 2020. Even my grandmom knew there's a Vision 2020 and it has a section and we have to do this, you know. And I think involving the people all through, you know, from the smallest unit to the different units, and having everybody rally on these programs. I think even for the humanitarian program, the reason why some of these things were sustained, it was because, in my opinion, the people owned these programs, and they were part of, you know, if it was building, you know, houses for the widows, you know, the whole community was involved, the youth were involved. It's not always a bed of roses. It was complicated and it was not easy. It was sometimes one step forward, one step back. We didn't even know how to properly, I think, do resource mobilization. What are the different sources of funding? But I think also bringing in the right manpower, the right people who know the different things. Some people are good at economy, some people are good at the education sector, some good at security, and deploying the national resources in the right way, I think it was. But the international community understood that, and I think it has always been like that, except that sometimes government don't know. But everything is an engagement, you know. Even you can discuss with World Bank about a loan that you want to take. It's like when you take a loan from the NNA Bank, you will know what you want to focus on, how you have to negotiate it. It's not that it will just come and be imposed on you. So I think what I really appreciate about the leadership is knowing what they want, knowing that you can engage with all these international opposition, and placing on the table what's your plan. I remember at some point, I think I went for resource mobilization in Europe, and it was difficult because some people had a view. It's like I tried to draw for them a graph. And I tried to say the country went to -50. And now we are at -30, for example. In our opinion as Rwandese, although you still see us in negatives, but we are celebrating the shift from -50 to -30.
I think that's a very good point to hold those thoughts and to now take a quick break. So please don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back. My guest is Madam Christine Umutoni, and we've spent a considerable amount of time talking about the response to the difficult period in which the country found itself after the genocide against the Tutsi. So where we stopped, you're talking about the financing for the reconstruction, rehabilitation, and the National Development Program. And it leads me to how some refugees in many parts of the world actually have been treated. We've seen videos of refugee camps where the refugees actually have air conditioners and generating sets. And here, we have a country that's been totally devastated, and you're trying to make a pitch to the international community. So, tell us, how well was the rehabilitation and reintegration financed by the international community? But more importantly, what constraints did you face in telling the story of the need for help from international actors?
The biggest challenge mobilizing resources for Rwanda was that the same partners where we are going for funding had been financing the previous regime only for their finances to end up buying machetes and killing people, and terrible things happened. So to bring back that trust of supporting a government in Rwanda, because some people don't know previous government, this new government. So to first position Rwanda's new direction, and it took a while. Most people actually, sometimes people understand these countries, but sometimes it's just, in passing. They really don't know what's going on. So it took a bit of time to convince that this is a different government. We deal with resources differently. But I think one way was also we were not thinking that we are going to rely on external resources only. Rwandans had been going through a whole liberation struggle, eating little, surviving and moving. So we knew a little bit about how to work with few resources to build bigger things. So I think at some time where resources were not coming in, we were using what we have to demonstrate that we can do. I mean, I used to go to work on foot and eat, you know, ordinary things.
As soon as Director for Reintegration and Rehabilitation.
Yeah. My minister was walking on foot to go to work, and it didn't take anything away that he's a minister until he was able to get a car, until he was able to get some things. We used to not to have, you know, pens and stuff, and, you know, we just mobilize. So living humble, using humble means to build what we want. It's not like you're building a country. Now the first thing you want to do is to build for yourself a house and to do whatever these things, but it's to start with the little that we have to build what can come. And so the country already was being led by people who are, who I should say are used to live in a humble way and to build on that. And so even the resources you would get, to better use the resources, because also it was a long-term practice on how do we use few resources to build what you want to build. So I think that was a major factor in rebuilding and reconstruction. But eventually, of course, we started doing roundtables. And this is where sometimes actually the UN supported us in doing these roundtable conferences, you know, for reconstruction of the country. We were not yet, we didn't know even how to do, you know, big project proposals or stuff like that. But, you know, we worked together with the partners and started going fundraising. What I was trying to say is that some governments, they have questions, you know, you don't have this, why are you asking this? But you would really say, I mean, we are coming from -50, we are now at -30. If you look at it in absolute terms, yes, we are negatives, we lack this. But if you look at it in the general context, we are moving forward. We can promise you that tomorrow we will be at -20, another day we'll be at -10, at 0, and we are moving. Now, if you support us, we could move faster. You know, in a short while we will be at -10, at 10. If not, we will still move, definitely, at a slower pace, but we will move. So we would like you to help us to move in this direction. And the most times you really have to place the entire picture, because if you're talking to a country in Europe, for example, never had war, never had what, and they're telling you your courts are not working, exactly, that's what we are here. Yes, our courts are not working, they are destroyed, they are what, we have built this, and this is where we are going. So I think it needed a lot of convincing, but I think at some point, yeah, we managed to get some resources.
This leads me thinking, actually, you make that point where the government was very insistent that this is what we want. If you want to help us, no tents, help us build structure. And the question is, where did this sense of resilience, where did it come from? Particularly, as you said, for a country in the period of genocide against the Tutsi that had nothing. And yet you talk about the Rwandan resilience. Is it in the DNA of Rwandans? Or did it come from the fact that you've looked around, those you thought would be helping you didn't help, and you created a mindset that it's us alone. If help comes, very well. If it doesn't come, we keep going. Where does one attribute this resilience as deriving from?
I think there's no one single factor. But of course, the idea that at one moment we were left alone and to fend for ourselves and ended the war, it is something to hold on to. You know, anyone, if you've gone through and you've done it and you've realized that no one was at your help, but you still managed to go through, irrespective of all the problems and the dark challenges, I think it's something to hold on to. But I think, as I said also, many people in the leadership had also experienced protracted wars and resilience and problems, and so that is also another thing to hold on to. But I think also another thing to hold on to was that, I mean, we have, it's us, we have a nation to build. And you could close your eyes and blame whoever you want to blame, but at the end of the day, this is Rwanda, we are Rwandese, we are not going to be Chinese or Indians or Nigerians or anything. It is us. And I think that's why even whether the reconciliation or reconstruction, it's that realization that we don't want to go back to 1994. And if the cure for that is the resilience, is the reconciliation, we are ready to take that pill and move on, because there is nowhere else to go. I tell you, it went to the bottom line. So in everyone's thing was, how can I make it work? You know, how can I not go back? Until today, if you ask me, until today, anything that reminds me of 1994, or you know, you keep looking forward because you can never go back. Some people's conflicts, I think, have not crushed them to that level. The Rwandan conflict crushed us to that level. Any kid, you talk to my daughter or anyone, they just want to move forward because what they see about what happened in the past is nowhere to go. So if that requires that you work together, you work together. It's like you have malaria, you have to take quinine to, it is a bitter pill sometimes, but you have to take it to cure. So I think there's so many factors. Leadership is one. You know.
I was going to come to the leadership question now because I deliberately have not asked you any questions about the reconciliation and national cohesion approaches because I want that to be a full interview series on its own. That's why I haven't come to those. But let's now come to the leadership as we start winding down this conversation. Many countries that have been in post-conflict contests, not even as bad as Rwanda's, have often gone back to conflict and violence. And the post-conflict settlements have not been as successful. And you kept talking about vision and leadership. What was unique about Rwanda's leadership that made all of this happen?
I really want to say that our leadership had a clear direction for the country. First, to pull it from all the problem, but to lead to prosperity. And there are stages and there are challenges in between, and there are different things to put together. But I think driven by that wish, we see our leadership and also leading by example. So why I was saying that leadership was key, because it's easy for people who have been in conflict, been killing each other, to go back on the street and start killing each other if led. After all, it is also another leadership had led the youth into the genocide. So, you know, young people, people generally, you can sway this in this way, sway them. But if everybody is seeing that they are being directed towards things that are beneficial for themselves, for rebuilding a nation, for living together, for growing a country stronger, I think it's very important. So for me, leadership and a leadership with a clear direction was very, very important in bringing the country from where we were. We always say that they led us through while bleeding, they led us while healing, and now they are leading us to prosperity. Those phases, and they themselves were bleeding, they were healing, and now they're leading us to prosperity. So it's, you know, it's like a puzzle, but that builds to a bigger thing. But it was very, very important to have that clear and strong leadership to pull every pieces together to move.
I'm happy you brought in the discourse on prosperity, because that's, I think, a good point for us to end this conversation by then being forward-looking and thinking now about what this means for the future of Rwanda. So from that moment, 1999 to now, and from this strategic focus of the government, the leadership, about the way the society should be reconstructed, everything has a structure, everything has foundational to build upon. So in your closing remarks now, can you reflect on what has lingered, what has survived, and where are those systems and the infrastructure now? And how does that help Rwanda in its journey to socioeconomic and structural transformation?
I think, like we said about building blocks and pillars, it is on those pillars that we see the nation moving, because if the nation had a plan for stabilization, they had a plan for reconstruction, a plan for the economy and the governance. So I think, you know, what we see today, every time I come home, I actually sometimes don't know where I am. Like everything has so improved. People are busy. Technology is moving, and it's quite exciting. But I should say that it was built and still built on those principles of resilience, those principles of you know, patriotism, the pillars of, you know, empowering the young people, empowering women, empowering the communities to do what they have to do. I see, I mean, I've heard about the Vision 2050, and I have no doubt that building on those pillars, seeing what is going on, and you know, Rwanda's choices. I was here when the country, I think, was trying to get its first fiber optic system, and we almost thought, what is these crazy ideas? Why are digging the holes and bringing it? And none of us knew how to use the computer or anything. But the vision of the leadership into technology is the future. You know, the youth are the future. You know, all these things is bearing results now, and we see it. But even the principle of, you know, believing in things, doing plans and implementing them, you know, acting on them, is something that is so important. But now, talking about the 60th anniversary of the UN, I cannot stop saying that the role of the, I mean, if I can comment on the role of the UN in this journey, at least of reconstruction, I know that from 1994, from the humanitarian to the development and peace building, there's so many things I can remember offhand where the UN supported. For example, even managing the humanitarian crisis. But, you know, if things like the Peace Institute in the northern Rwanda started as a small, you know, sometimes some of these things started as just trials, you know, and then it became a center of excellence. Institutions like the KIST, some resources from UN agencies, and then something comes, you know, gender equality, GBV, gender-based violence. There's so many, even with supporting the Gacaca courts, or there's so many things where the UN was a partner to this country. And I remember the development partners meetings that were co-chaired by the Minister of Finance and the UN resident coordinator, happening every year. I don't know, maybe now they happen every 2 years. But coordination had always been a strong role of the UN. Even Rwanda was a pilot, I think, for the One UN, and which worked well, and until today, the One UN in Rwanda is a reality. So we could say a lot, but yes, there was some history, especially on the decisions of the UN during the genocide. But in the reconstruction journey, I think the UN listened to Rwanda, and the UN, because it's a neutral partner, they are here to support development of a nation, and the partnership framework that started through UNDAFs and now have grown into other things. I think the UN had an ear to understand the development aspirations of Rwanda and to accompany that, and actually as a good example to other countries. So I would really congratulate you on the 60th, celebrating the 60th anniversary of the UN.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Umutoni. We congratulate you as well and all Rwandans. Thank you for being my guest on Decision Moments. And when you get back to your country of service in Mauritius, we wish you all the very best.
Thank you very much, and welcome to
Thank
Rwanda, my
you.
country.
Thank you very much
for your service.
So, dear listeners, we've interrogated a very difficult phase in the life of Rwanda, and we've learned very important lessons about national ownership, national leadership, a vision by the political leadership about the direction in which they wanted to take their country, and a desire to prevent institutionalization for children, to prevent having people in refugee camps, promote quick return to the communities, and active engagement in building systems and laying firm foundations, not temporary structures, and building on those foundations and scaling them up. These were novel in 1994, 1996 to 2000. And now these ideas have become mainstream in global development, which helps us appreciate what the government and the people of Rwanda bring to the discourse on international development. That's a happy note for us to close this conversation. And we look forward to welcoming you to another edition of Decision Moments. Thank you for joining us today.